In the words of the great Tom Scott, Houdini 20.5 is out and I have a cold. And while I'm battling with my voice a bit, Houdini now has Copernicus, a brand new, still beta, rebuild of the image workspace made for texturing and comping and generally everything 2D. Now the focus of side effects for this release was texture synthesis. And while there are a lot of tutorials about generating completely bespoke textures from noises out there already, what really interested me was a workflow similar to programs like Substance Painter or Armor Paint, where I can bring in multiple PBR materials and layer them onto an object with lots of fancy masks. And this already works, just maybe with a bit more manual work than you're used to from these other programs. So let's take a look. Let's start out in an empty scene. Let's drop down a geo node, and before we dive into Corps, into Copernicus, I first of all want to bring in the object that I want to texture. In my case, this will be an object that I got from Polyhaven, and all the objects and all the textures that I'm going to use today are either coming from Polyhaven or CG Bookcase, and you can find links for them in the description. Let's drop down FBX Skin Import. Let's select the file that we want to import, and for me this will be under Assets, this fire hydrant, and this fire hydrant 4k.fbx. Now, first of all, we need to unpack this FBX, so let's drop down an unpack node to get editable geometry, like this. And we have two versions of this fire hydrant, one clean one and one dirty one, and we need only one of them. So let's blast the other one away with a blast node. And in here, let's check if the name attribute on this object is equal to everything that ends with _aged, like this. Let's also get rid of some unnecessary attributes with an attrib delete. And let's select the ones that we want to keep. And this will be, of course, the P attribute. Of course, on normals and our UVs, and also the name attribute on primitives, because we can use this to select, for example, between our chain and our main hydrant. Let's move it to the center. For this, let's use a match size node, wire this down, and set justify Y to none and justify Z to none to just move it to the center toward origin. And finally, I want to give it one level of subdivision to make it look a bit neater and to give me a bit more points to work with. This is our prep work done. Let's finally end this with a null. Let's call this null main, and now we can create our corpnet. And I want to create this corpnet here in SOPs because the new Copernicus workflow works really well also with SOP geometry, and this is, I think, the right place to drop down one for this texturing workflow. Now on this corpnet we have a bunch of options. The main options that I want to look at are these ones here, because these are the default properties for each layer, for each picture that we're going to create inside Corps. And for now, I want to up the resolution to 4K, since this is sort of my standard texture resolution that I like to work with. And I also want to make sure that the default border is set to wrap, so we get tiling textures. Now let's set our display flag at our corpnet and let's jump inside. And first of all, I need a way to display my fire hydrant and the textures that I'm going to create for it. So for this, first of all, for a fire hydrant, I need a SOP import. I want to check use external SOP, and I want to reference this main null that I created. And now this fire hydrant is also in Corps. And to preview all the textures that we're going to create, there's a preview material node right here. And this basically acts like a principal shader where I can plug in all my different PBR maps and I get a PBR preview here in the viewport. The line display here is a bit annoying, so let's turn this off up here, and now this is all working. And also with the new Corps workflow, I can jump back to SOPs, and what this node also outputs is again a SOP model with a shader attached to it with all the right textures linked in. But for now, inside our corpnet, let's first of all bring in a first set of PBR textures. And I could do this, for example, with a file node. In here, load in the first picture in my text folder, which I think will be under CG Bookcase, this painted metal texture right here, and let's load in the base color map right here. We can get a preview here, and if we, for example, wire this into the base color, and maybe also set the texture type to RGB to have here the right color or the right data type flowing into the base color right here. And if I preview this now, I have this texture on my object. Now this workflow right here, where I need for all my PBR layers one file node, and then also if I want to mix this with another PBR layer, for each layer one single mix node, and so on and so forth. This gets really old really fast. And there's also, at least in the default corpse workflow, no easy way around this, because now with this new corpse network, every noodle can carry just one picture, just one map. So to make this a bit more bearable, I'm going to do something pretty unusual, and I'm going to bring in an HDA, a Houdini digital asset that I created earlier. Now you can also find this digital asset in the scene file downloads, and you can also watch a separate tutorial that we're also uploading today, where we're going over how to create this digital asset. For now, let's bring this in. So let's go to File, Import, and Houdini digital asset. And this lives in my HIP file under HDA, and this is corp_and.pbrlayer.1.0.hda. Let's hit accept and install. And now we can find this PBR layer simply by opening the tab menu and going to digital assets right here. And what this digital asset does is it gives us one area where we can load in a diffuse map, a metalness map, a roughness map, and a normal map. And it also gives us the opportunity to mix it with a different material that also has a diffuse, metalness, roughness, and normal map with a mask. And we also have some general tweaks we can do for this material that we're loading in. So let's use this to bring in our painted metal. Let's load in all the right textures in here. Right now, this node is complaining, and it is complaining because it expects a different set of textures coming in through those inputs. We can turn this off by simply going to the General tab and ticking First Layer. And now we have all our maps loaded in here, and we can check them all out with the selector down here. And for example, check out the metalness or the roughness or the normal, like this. And now let's get rid of a file node right here, and let's wire those into our PBR material. So diffuse goes into base color, metalness into metalness, roughness into roughness, and normal into normal. And this is how it looks on a fire hydrant, which right now isn't too great. So let's use some of the options that we have in here to adjust this a bit. First of all, I want to change the texture scaling or the texture transform, and I just want to change the uniform scale to a value of 0.3. I think this looks a lot nicer and also hides the UV seams on our object a lot better. Then of course a fire hydrant should be red, so let's go into the diffuse tab and use the HSV adjustments right there. I want to set the U shift to a value of 336. And I also want to bring down the saturation a bit, -0.1, and the value scale as well, 0.65. And I think this is a nice color for the fire hydrant. Let's go to the roughness. I want to bring the top roughness down a bit, make this a bit more glossy. So let's set the output max to a value of 0.5. And let's also go to the normal, because the normal map right now is pretty strong. And let's turn this down as well. Let's say a value of 0.4. This is my base layer for this fire hydrant. And now I want to set up different layers, different material properties, and layer them on top. And next I want to have a sort of bare metal texture that I want to have both on my chains right here and also on the exposed bits of this fire hydrant, like paint has been scraped off in there. So let's first of all bring in another PBR layer. Let's load in our maps. In this case I'm using this old iron, again from CG Bookcase. And let's wire this into a node tree here. And again I'm quickly going to tweak some parameters on this texture. Again the uniform scale, again the max roughness, and again the normal. And for some reason in my viewport, the metalness texture or metals in general look a bit off. I think this is just a few of those quirks with the new Vulkan viewport in Houdini 20 that will get ironed out over the next releases. But in Karma, this looked nice and actually like metal. But again, I don't want to have my entire fire hydrant be metal. I want to have now a few masks to limit this metal material to different areas. For example, those chains in here. So I now have to create a mask that goes in here that just selects, for example, these chains. And this is where we get into the really cool features with this new Copernicus workflow, because we can bring a lot of data from SOPs really easily into corps and use them there, for example, to create masks. In this case, if we jump back out, and take a look at the info panel in here, and yes, this is a new info panel with Houdini 20.5, we have this name attribute here under primitives, which selects different parts of objects. So for example, these caps here and these chains. And we can probably use this name attribute right here to create an ID map that we can later use inside Corps to create a mask from this. Now, there's one slight problem with this, because right now this name attribute is a string attribute and ID maps in Corps currently only work with integers. So we have to turn this also into an integer attribute, but this is quite easily done with an enumerate node. By this below our main null, let's set the group type to primitives. Let's select a piece attribute called name. Let's set the mode to enumerate pieces, and let's give the attribute that's coming out a name, for example ID, and this should be an integer. And now we have this ID attribute right here, which also selects all the right geometry that we want. Now we have to bring this into Corps as well, so let's use another null. Let's call this AOVs, and let's jump back into Corps. I'll highlight our CorpNet again, and let's bring in, first of all, this AOV geometry with another SOP import. Again, use external SOP, and again, use the AOVs null right here. Now to bring this attribute into Corps as a map, we have to rasterize it. And for this, we're going to use a rasterized geometry node. And right now, if I just wire in my geometry right here, as we can see, we first of all just get an alpha. This is the default that's set up in here. But we get an alpha from a sort of default perspective, a default front perspective of our object, which is not what we want. We of course want this to be our UV map. So to turn this into a UV map, there's one additional node that we need in here, and that's the Rasterized Setup node. Let's wire this in between, and let's set the space from position to UVs. And now we have our UV map in here. Now again, this is set to alpha. This is not what we need. We need our ID attribute. So let's click this plus here to create another attribute or to bring in another attribute. This should be an ID attribute, and it should be called ID. Or the attribute that we want to bring in is called ID. And now in here, if we change the preview to ID, we can see we have this ID map right here. Now this is still not a mask, so to turn it into a mask, let's use a ID to mask node like this. Wire in our ID, highlight this node, and up here we have the ID pattern. This is basically where we want to enter the integer that describes our chains, and we can simply scroll through the different IDs. However, in this case, I know that the chains have an ID of 4. And finally, let's make this a bit more orderly. Maybe something like this, and let's bring in our mask to a second PBR layer, and let's preview our object again. And now just the chains have this metal texture right here. But again, I don't want to have this metal texture just on the chains. I also want to have it on the exposed bits where paint might rub off. So let's create this next. Let's jump back out to our subs context. Let's jump back to our AOVs, and let's think about what attribute could create such a map or such a mask for us. And I think we can use a measure node for this. Let's wire this in. And on this measure node, we could measure on point level the curvature. And taking a look at the preview, this does a really good job at highlighting all the exposed bits and also the crevices that we can later use, for example, to maybe add a dirt texture into our object as well. I want to set the curvature type or the measure type to mean, because what this will do is all the convex bits of our object will have a positive value, and all the concave bits of our object will have a negative value. And this later will make it really easy to select the right parts of the object for the right textures. And in the end, we're outputting an attribute called curvature. So let's bring this into Corps as well. Highlight our CorpNet again. Let's turn off the visualizer. I'll jump back to our camera tool and let's jump inside. We want to go to a rasterized geo node, and we want to bring in an additional attribute. This will be a mono attribute, and this will be called curvature. And again, previewing this, we now have a pretty nice curvature map. Now to isolate the exposed bits, I want to remap this a bit. So let's drop down a remap node. Let's wire in the curvature into the source. I don't want to change the input min and input max, and the output min and output max as well, but I want to play with this ramp a bit, and I want to bring in the lower level in a bit like this, and I want to bring in the upper level a bit like this. And let's see what this mask does if we plug this into a mask input. And I think right now this is a bit harsh, so let's bring the upper level up a bit. And what happened right now is something that unfortunately did happen quite a lot with me, at least with my PC and Houdini 20.5, and this preview material node, it's still a somewhat crashy node. However, the usual way of going to file, crash recovery, and open crash file usually results in no actual work lost, just waiting around for Houdini to open again. So let's keep going in here. Maybe this mask just by itself is a bit too bland. Maybe let's mix it also with a noise. So let's create a fractal noise in here. Let's take a look at that. Bring up the parameters. Let's maybe bring up the contrast a bit and bring down the center a bit. Maybe something like this. And let's multiply this with our remapped curvature map. Let's drop down a multiply node. This is simply a blend node with the multiply preset applied. And let's wire both of our textures in here. Let's maybe turn down the element size a bit, something like this. And let's wire this into our mask, see what we're getting here. I think this looks a bit better. And let's also mix it with our ID mask. So for this, let's add both of those together. ID mask goes in here, a multiply or edge mask goes in here, and then finally this goes here into the PBR layer. And now we have our metalness layer finished as well. Next I want to create some dirt, and I want this dirt to accumulate both in the crevices of this fire hydrant and also on all the underside bits, because water may be running down the sides, staying in here and getting really ugly and damp and disgusting down here, basically. So for this, let's also bring in another texture, another PBR layer node, and this will be under tags and under polyhaven, this brown mud. Now this texture is somewhat special because it does not have a metalness texture in here. So to fix this, under metalness, I have here the option to toggle a solid color for a metalness texture. And I want to have this simply set to 0 because mud is not a metal. And let's wire this into a main node tree in here. And currently on a hydrant, this looks like this. Again, I want to change up some stuff. So first of all, again, I want to scale it down. And again, I want to bring down the normals a bit, like this. Now to have this accumulate only in the crevices of a fire hydrant, we can reuse our curvature map down here. We simply need another remap node for this. And a curvature into our source. And in here to select our crevices, I want to set the input max to -1 instead of 1. So this will highlight all the concave bits. And again, I want to tweak this ramp down here, bring up the lower level and the upper level like this. Let's make a bit more room here. Our node tree is getting quite big. Let's wire this node into the mask input of our brown mud. And let's preview this as well. And yeah, now we have some dirt accumulating here in the crevices. Now again, I want to have some dirt on the underside of my fire hydrant as well. So for this, let's bring in another attribute. Let's jump back to subs, back to our AOVs. And in here, I want to use a mask by feature. And this by default is set up to create a mask attribute that shines from the top of our object to the bottom. However, we can simply reverse this here in the direction. Let's add a -1 on the Y field instead of a 1. And we can also turn off cast shadows, so we get all the bottom bits of a fire hydrant. Let's jump back into Cops. Let's bring this mask attribute that we created in. So again, to our rasterize geo, again hit this plus button, again select mono and call it mask. And in here is our bottom mask. I want to remap this as well. So again, let's drop down a remap node in our mask section down here. Let's wire in our mask into the source. And let's again bring up the bottom and the top a bit. And again, mix it with the edge mask that we already have. Let's add both of them together to get this mask. And let's finally use this mask in our dirt texture. And now we have some dirt accumulating here on the bottom faces of a fire hydrant as well. Now the very last thing that I want to add to this fire hydrant are some decals, because what would be a substance like workflow without decals? To do this, I want to jump out back to subs again. And in this case, I won't use in the end a point attribute, but I want to use the new or somewhat newish texture mask paint workflow. Because what this does is it's basically used like a mask paint node, but instead of painting point attributes, we're painting onto a 2D volume, which can later act like a texture. Let's wire in our object in here. Let's jump into the handles too. Right here on the parameters, we can set a mask resolution. And again, I'm selecting a 4K resolution in here. and this somehow mixed up the shading in here. Let's maybe see if we can fix it. Yep, simply jumping out to the camera tool and back into the handles to fix it. And now, for example, we could simply go in here, let's change our brush size a bit and start painting onto our object. Or in this case, I want to stamp on a logo or tag my logo. So let's set up this. Let's set the brush to stamp. Let's load in the alpha image that we want to use. And in this case, this is this white on black version of our Entagma N. I also want to bring on the soft edge to 0. And now let's adjust the size of our brush, maybe something like this, and paint it on here like this. Now to bring this into COPS, we're worrying about the second output of this node, the mask volumes output. And for this, I'm going to create another null, wire this in, and let's call this Decals. And you can sort of see our texture right here. And to make this work, let's jump back into our COPNet. Let's maybe make some room here. Let's bring this in with another SOP import. Again, use external SOP and choose the Decals. And now to turn this into a layer that we can use inside our COP workflow, we can in here simply use a geometry to layer node because this is just a 2D volume and this node is used to turn 2D volumes into images. And now we have our mask in here. And to use this mask, I simply, in this case, just want to modify the diffuse channel. And I want to simply modify it with a solid color. So for this, let's drop down a constant, wire this into our diffuse channel. And let's use the mask in here. And I want to simply have a white color for it and Entagma N logo. And now this is brought into COPS as well. So this is all my texturing done. If I want to export these textures, all I need to do is drop down a null, where this, for example, behind my diffuse map. Let's call this diffuse, and then drop down a ROP image output. And in this node, I can reference my diffuse null in here. I can set up my file name. So in this case, maybe diffuse.jpg. Since I'm working with ACES in here, I'm using the color space conversion, and I want to use sRGB texture. And I think this is all I need to do in here, so let's click render to disk. And if I bring in a file node now, go to the render folder, load in my diffuse texture, set this to RGB, let's take a look at it. This does look correct, and if we plug it into our base color and preview our geometry again, yeah, we got the same output. And finally, if we want to have a quick render of our object, all we need to do is jump back out into Geo, back into Stage, and in Stage drop down a Scene Import All. Maybe also drop down an Environment Light. Maybe select one of the built-in ones from Houdini. Let's maybe select the Skylight Garage. And then simply go to Karma XPU, and we should be able to view our fire hydrant in all its glory. Something like this. So this is it for today. This is our first intro into COPS. I think we're not quite done yet in exploring some substance or armor paint-like workflows in COPS. If you have ideas for other features from those programs that you would like to see replicated, for example, stuff like particle paints, leave a comment down below. I'm really looking forward to read what you're interested in. But until next time, it's cheers and goodbye. And if you like what we're doing, please also consider becoming a patron of ours, not only for supporting Entagma, but for access to in-depth courses on topics such as KineFX, Vellum, Vex, Python, and maybe some future courses very, very soon, and so on and so forth. Also, let me say thank you so much for all of our existing patrons. Without you, this channel would not be possible. Thank you.